Hello and welcome to You Talking to Me. No to a mandatory quotas to relocate migrants has been agreed by the 28 EU leaders of Europe during the last European summit last June. So the 40,000 migrants who already reach Europe will be distributed to a voluntary basis and not a mandatory scheme as proposed by the European Commission. Mandatory, voluntary, that was the controversial words of the debate. So this has highlights some lack of solidarity within the European Union, because who will take in these refugees? That's the question. And we were going to discuss this and debate this with my two guests of today, two members of the European Parliament. Mrs. Rebecca Harms, co-chair of the Greens Group. Hello.
Hello.
And Mr. Timothy Kirkhope, a British member of the European Conservatives and Reformists Group.
Hello.
Hello and welcome, both of you. So in total, we are talking about 60,000 migrants, including 20,000 who have not reached the European borders. And so 60,000 refugees. All this mess for this, Mrs. Harms, is this a shame for Europe, do you think?
So I think it's not a good day when they decided this way, but it was not the only mistake done by the European Union and the leaders in the Union when it comes to migration and political asylum. I think the fundamental problem is the Dublin regulation, in which for a long period all the burdens of refugees and migrants coming to Europe have been left to the countries like Greece or Italy, smaller countries like Cyprus, for example, close to the places outside of Europe from where the refugees come to Europe. And the Dublin regulation was a decision to give the responsibility, to leave the responsibility for all procedures in the countries of first entry in Europe. And this was wrong. And we have to rebalance it, and the summit failed to really correct what has to be corrected.
So, Mr. Kirkhope, do you also agree with Mrs. Harms? The Dublin system has to be just revised. That's the first thing.
I don't actually agree about a number of these things with Mrs. Harms, but what I wanted to say was that certainly previous arrangements where the Commission has decided that there should be some kind of quota scheme have not succeeded. I think Dublin I and Dublin II did not succeed, even though they were essentially voluntary. And Europe obviously has a responsibility as a whole. All the countries in Europe have a responsibility for this, to deal with this issue of migrants.
But we're talking about 60,000 people.
Well, we're talking about 60,000 now. That's this year. But the total numbers that are heading towards Europe, want to come to Europe, or indeed in many cases do not, but are being trafficked by criminals, all kinds of categories of people are arriving on our shores. These are substantially larger numbers, and we therefore must target our help, first of all, target the help first to the countries where these people are arriving. But in terms of mandatory or even voluntary quotas, I do think that is another issue which really needs to be much more carefully thought about. I think the Commission have got it wrong so far.
So mandatory, voluntary, as Mrs.
I think, first of all, the quota idea. I think that, for example, the countries I know best in center of Europe, for example, Germany or Poland or the Netherlands, so it's for those countries and their citizens, quotas could be very helpful, because then the how do you say it? The challenge, is clear. There are limits. So this year we have that many, and what do we have to do to accommodate everything? And it makes so the dealing with the problems much easier.
But there is no way, of course, nobody's thought through this question of secondary movements. For instance, you can allocate people to a country in the first place, but unless you restrict their movements, then they can move from there anywhere else in Europe. So this scheme breaks down in terms of the ongoing care for these people. But also, you haven't answered, but what you don't answer, what we need to do is to make sure that at the first place they arrive, they must then be dealt with, looked at, and decisions have to be taken as to whether these are genuine asylum seekers, genuine refugees, whether they are economic migrants, whether they're being trafficked by criminals.
But here we're talking about refugees who are flying from wars, from security.
Well, sometimes that's the case, but no, lots of them are coming because they are criminally trafficked by individuals who we're not dealing with in the countries where they come from.
They are criminally trafficked, but they anyway want to go to Europe.
But that doesn't mean they are refugees,
and among these 60,000, we have 20,000 people. They belong to the resettlement program of the United Nations. They are clearly defined as those people, for example, now from Syria or in Syria. They need to change place because they can't survive. These are the weakest.
No, but I'm not talking United Nations.
And also, Mr. Kirkhope, the procedures you talked about. So Greece or Italy or Spain, it depends very much on the changing situations. They cannot do all the procedures which have to be done in Europe.
We want to, we've got a recorded question from Claudia in Germany for AMS Radio, also a member of Euranet Plus network, and she had a question for you both. We listen.
I guess we all agree that this kind of compromise shows again the lack of solidarity in the EU. In real families, the direction is often shown by the stronger ones. So, to be really provocative, who is paying more has more rights to say we go this or that direction.
Mr. Kirkhope, do you want to react to what Claudia asked for?
Well, the presumption is that the biggest countries have the biggest say. But in actual fact, if you take a look at Europe at the moment, then the biggest countries, by and large, do already deal with a greater number of people who want refugee status than the smaller.
UK, for example?
Yeah, the UK is one of the highest. And can I just say this? I was responsible in the 90s for the United Nations Refugee Resettlement Programme for Bosnia in the UK. I was very pleased to be involved. I think all of us were. And I have no problem now with the United Nations programmes, resettlement programmes. What I have a problem with, though, is that although you say resources are not available, we really have to provide those resources so people can be determined as to what categories they fall into when they arrive in Europe. And otherwise, what is happening is the first countries under pressure are simply moving people on to other countries who are then complaining, and we don't get solidarity, we just get a really tricky situation.
Yeah, Ms.
But so those people from the resettlement program of the United Nations to arrive in Europe, they are defined. So these are pregnant women, these are children, these are people suffering from diseases, and they have to be resettled based on a decision of United Nations. And I think nobody should doubt that we take them.
But the United Nations settlement program does not cover all
we
these
are taking to Europe,
arriving.
I think, still less than we should take. So comparing what is necessary in the regions of war and what United Nations has already listed, so I think Europe is still too weak in taking solidarity in the United Nations.
So by the end, it's by the end of July, the Interior Minister will need to fix and to set up some redistribution scheme around these migrants. But even if there is an agreement, then the European Parliament will also position on it. So it's not only start by next autumn. Isn't that too late, knowing that we have reached today even more than 130,000 people across
I don't like the Commission and its proposals. Things have to move a little bit faster than this. If the European Parliament spends its time considering these matters, months and months go on, the numbers will not be 40,000, 60,000, 80,000 or 100,000. It will be a substantially greater number of people. And we will, in the meantime, have to find a way in which we can deal with them arriving in the European Union. But also we have to now go back to the sources here and to try and make sure that people do not set out on hazardous journeys, do not come to Europe with false expectations. That is unfair. It's not moral. It's not right that we should have people treated that way.
So by the end of July, Mrs. Harms, what do we need to set up? How will the member states also share in a responsible way the taking of these refugees?
I think the complete wrong attitude is that mostly so the member states tried to avoid to get more refugees in their countries, be it a resettlement program or be it people seeking political asylum. So we tried to avoid it. This hindered a development in which we prepare the infrastructure for more refugees who will arrive in Europe. So the offers must be clear. So we must teach them our languages. We must offer them skills so that if they stay, they can work. If they leave, and many might tend to go back to countries of origin with their skills, they can help them.
Thank you. So we'll have a look at our Facebook comments reaction. So Lenka, she wrote that how many migrants will have, by example, in Slovakia? What are the criteria defining the quota of migrants a country would receive? So Mr. Kirkhope, do you think there will be a share of responsibility in a voluntary basis between the member states?
Well, I think that's very difficult to predict. I think some countries have made it very clear that they believe it is a national competence as to who they will have in their country, and they have said very clearly that they do not expect to have to take greater numbers of people. And this is coming out from a lot of countries. Certainly the UK is not part of Schengen, of course, but nevertheless, we have, through other schemes like United Nations, like other things, we have taken a considerable number of people over the years, and we still are proud to give sanctuary to people who meet the United Nations criteria for asylum. But I think that what we have at the moment is a more complicated situation where we actually do need to look at some of the causes of this, and not merely to say people will come and we must look after them. That's not acceptable. That is not proper in a migration sense.
And then we have actually a question from Stavros from Greece. Actually, he had a question related to the anger of the Italian Prime Minister during the European Summit, Matteo Renzi. We listen.
The Italian Prime Minister, Matteo Renzi, threatened other European leaders for them to accept only to start talking on the possibility to resettle 40,000 migrants. So my question is, isn't this a development that shows that a European solution to tackle the issue of migration is almost impossible at the moment?
Mr. Kirkhope?
I think
immigration and endless battle?
I think it is very difficult at the moment, but I do say to Mr. Renzi and to others on the borders, as it were, where people arrive, and that is not just on the Mediterranean, of course, we're talking also about the eastern parts of Europe as well.
Actually we have to mention Hungary,
Serbia. I mean, it's not the only place. We are concerned, obviously, on our side of Europe, but there are other issues too. But what I feel is that we need to provide more resources, and it is available. Vice President Timmermans of the Commission confirmed that where we have what the Commission term as hotspots, that is places where a larger number of people are arriving, then those are places where more resources of the European Union can be provided if the nation states apply for it. As I'm aware at the moment, that I don't think Italy, and I'm not sure what Greece's position is at the moment, but certainly I don't think there has been a formal application for help. And there ought to be. And we need to put more resources there, apart from doing all the other things that we need to do as well.
Mrs. Arms, emphasis should also be put on Serbia, Hungary, who faces also huge migrants flows.
So I spoke yesterday with people working in NGOs in Macedonia, and they described me an awful situation about many refugees entering in their country. They think this country will face also humanitarian crisis because of this. So we have to deal with these huge numbers of people fleeing from their homes. They have reasons for it. We will not be able to help all the people who are leaving their homelands. So we have, in the same time, to fight against the reasons for migration. But Europe is still far away from dealing in an adequate way, adequate to our strengths, with offers and also with legal migration.
But actually,
we
with
need
Europe,
legal migration
overall
to
dealing
Europe.
with migration, we have one question from Italy this time, Sergio, who is asking a question related to this European deal with it.
Good afternoon. I've got a very simple question for both guests. Is there a European Union as we mean it when we talk about migration? Or there are simply 28 member states and we have to accept that? I mean, there is no real European Union. That's it. Thank you.
Mr. Kirkhope, as we were introducing just before?
Very good question. I think that at the end of the day, most states that are members of the European Union do believe that they have the ultimate right to determine who comes into their countries.
Even if we're talking about 60,000 people?
Yeah, I think
in an emergency way?
I think at the end of the day, the national parliaments, the national governments would like to retain control of that way. I think obviously there are others who think that they should not, or that we should merge all these things together. But I think that the reality, and that's what I'm talking about now, the reality is that we are very far away from that situation. And that is one of the reasons why, of course, we are having at the moment such difficulties.
Mrs. Sams?
So we are a union in which many of the member states, the different nations, faced in the dark times. Similar problems. We had nations like Germany. Many had to flee because of the Nazi time. We saw Spain. We saw also Ireland, UK. So it's East-West, not to forget East-West. And so this European Union, based on our history, should really be able to come to common solutions to protect also our common values when it comes to people in such a danger, in such a risk, like the refugees now coming to Europe.
But I have to say,
that will be the last word for today.
I just want to make it quite clear that I think that movement of people in the world, for various reasons, not just to get away from fearful regimes, but for a load of other reasons, some economic migrancy, some to do with climate change in due course. The movement of people is going to be one of the biggest challenges that Europe, or any of the countries in Europe, will have over the next 20 years or more. And I think we need now to try and make sure that everybody wants to act in a friendly and voluntary manner on this, rather than to be things to be imposed on them, which I know they are not going to deliver.
But then it has to be effective in a voluntary way.
Yes.
But if, for example, this idea of economic reasons for refugees, so if somebody is with his family close to dying from starvation, and we saw those times in Ireland, for example, has he no good reason to leave his country?
So we understood that people flying from wars, insecurity, needs to be protected, and Mr. Kirkhope, also we need to be sure that there are not traffickers or not.
We need to determine
reasons
precisely what is going on with the people that are coming first, as soon as we can when they arrive, not later.
Thank you very much for being my guest today, and thank you all for watching us. Bye.